By 8 p.m. on Thanksgiving, my phone had rung 11 times, and every single call was from a family member who had told me 3 weeks earlier that I was not invited, and I let every one of those calls go to voicemail, and I sat at my own table, in my own apartment with my best friend Claudia, and her boyfriend, and my neighbor Roberta, who was 74 and had nowhere to go, and I had cooked for 4 people, and the food was hot and the candles were lit, and outside my window, the city was doing what cities do on holidays, which is go quiet in a particular way that makes everything inside feel more deliberate. And my phone rang for the 12th time, and Claudia looked at it and looked at me and said, "Are you going to answer?" And I said no, and she said good, and we had pie. And I did not feel guilty, and I did not feel angry, and I felt something that took me a few days to name, which was complete. And that feeling was so unfamiliar after 33 years of Thanksgiving at my Aunt Carol's house that I sat with it for a long time to make sure it was real, and it was absolutely real. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. And you know what? I say this every time, but I genuinely mean it today. I am so glad you're here for this one because this story is equal parts infuriating and deeply satisfying, and I have needed to tell it for a while now. My name is Grace Tillman, and I am 33 years old. And this past Thanksgiving was the first one I spent outside of my Aunt Carol's house in my entire life. And the reason I was not at Carol's house was not my choice. It was Carol's choice. And Carol had communicated that choice to me on a Sunday afternoon in early November when she had called and said, "Grace, I need to talk to you about Thanksgiving." And I had said, "Okay," and she had said, "We're keeping it small this year." And I had said, "What does small mean?" And she had said, "Just immediate family." And I had said, "Carol, I have been at your Thanksgiving for 33 years. And she had said, "I know. And this year, we just want it to be immediate family." And I had said, "Am I not immediate family?" And she had gone quiet, and then she had said, "Grace, you know what I mean?" And I had said, "I really don't, Carol." And she had said, "We just need a quieter year." And I had said, "Okay." And I had hung up, and I had sat with that phone call for about 4 minutes, and then I had opened my notes app and I had started a grocery list because I was going to cook my own Thanksgiving, and it was going to be for people who actually wanted me there. The history behind Carol's decision is not complicated. It is just consistent, and it goes like this. I am the only person in my family who cooks, and I have been cooking Thanksgiving at Carol's house since I was 19 years old when my grandmother got sick and could no longer manage the kitchen. And I had stepped in because someone had to, and because I genuinely love to cook. And for 14 years, I had shown up the Wednesday before Thanksgiving to prep, and I had cooked through Thursday morning, and I had managed the timeline and the dishes and the dietary restrictions and the last-minute additions to the guest list. And I had done all of this while also being seated at the far end of the table, away from the main conversation, and being introduced to Carol's husband's colleagues as my niece, who is very useful in the kitchen, and while watching my cousin Derek, who had never once peeled a potato, be praised at every dinner for his professional accomplishments, and while listening to Carol tell the room that Thanksgiving just wouldn't be the same without her mother's recipes, which were not her mother's recipes. They were mine recipes. I had developed over 14 years from a base of her mother's handwritten cards, and significantly improved. And I had smiled through all of it for 14 years. Because that is what you do when you have been taught that your value is in your usefulness and not in your presence. And November of this year was the first time I understood that those two things are not the same. 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, I told Claudia I was not going to Carol's, and Claudia said finally, and I said, "I'm going to cook here." And she said, "I'm coming," and I said, "Obviously." And I called my neighbor Roberta, who had mentioned in October that her daughter lived across the country, and holiday travel was difficult. And I said, "Roberta, do you have Thanksgiving plans?" And she said, "Not really, dear." And I said, "Come to mine." And she said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "Completely." And I spent the 2 weeks before Thanksgiving cooking the way I cook when I am doing it for myself, which is with full attention and zero compromise. And I made a brine for the turkey on Monday, and I made pie crusts on Tuesday, and I made stock from scratch on Wednesday. And I set my table with the good plates I had been saving for occasions that felt worthy, and I put candles on the table, and I called Claudia and said, "Be here at noon." And she said, "I'll bring wine," and I said, "Bring 2 bottles," and she said, "Done." Thanksgiving morning, I was up at 6, and the turkey went in at 7. And by 9, the apartment smelled the way I had spent 14 years making Carol's house smell. And I want to be specific about that, because there is something clarifying about realizing that the atmosphere you created for someone else for 14 years can exist entirely without them. And by 10, the pie was in. And by 11, I had made the cranberry sauce from scratch, the way I always do. And by noon, Claudia and her boyfriend Marcus arrived, and Roberta came at 12:30 with a bottle of wine. She said she had been saving for a special occasion. And I said, "Roberta, this absolutely qualifies." And she laughed, and we opened it immediately. And at 1 p.m., my phone rang for the first time. And the screen said Aunt Carol, and I looked at it, and I let it ring. And Claudia raised an eyebrow, and I shrugged, and we kept talking. And at 1:45, it rang again. And this time it was my cousin Derek, and I let that ring too, and at 2:15 Carol called again, and at 2:30 my mother called, which was more complicated because my mother and I have a different relationship. But my mother had known about Carol's decision and had not said anything to advocate for me, and I let that one ring too, and I made a note to call her the following day. And at 3 p.m. we sat down, and I want to tell you about that table because the table matters, and the table had 4 people and the right amount of food. And Roberta, said Grace, and she said it in the particular way of someone who means every word. And Marcus said, "This is the best turkey I have ever had in my life." And I said, "Thank you." And Claudia said, "You have been wasting this on Carol for 14 years. And I said, "I know." And Roberta said, "Who is Carol?" And Claudia said, "Exactly." And we laughed. And outside the city was quiet, and the candles were lit, and my phone was face down on the kitchen counter. And I was more present at that table than I had been at any Thanksgiving I could remember. At 4:15, the calls became texts, and the texts were from Carol, and they said, "Grace, are you there?" And then, "Grace, we have a situation," and then, "Grace, the turkey is not working." And I read them in order while standing in my kitchen cutting a second piece of pie, and I put my phone back down and went back to the table. And at 5:30, Derek called 4 times in a row, which is the calling pattern of someone who is genuinely panicking. And at 6, my mother sent a message that said, "Grace, I know you're upset, but Carol's oven stopped working, and the turkey is raw, and there are 14 people here, and I need you to call me back." And I read that message standing at my kitchen sink washing a dish, and I thought about 14 years of Wednesday prep and Thursday mornings, and being introduced as very useful in the kitchen, and I dried my hands, and I went back to the living room where Roberta was telling Claudia about a Thanksgiving in 1987 that had involved a raccoon and a sweet potato casserole, and I sat down, and I listened to the story, and I laughed in the right places. And at 7:15, I sent my mother one text that said, "I hope everyone finds a solution. Mom, I'm having a lovely evening," and I put my phone in a drawer. And at 8 p.m., Carol called for the 11th time, and I was sitting at the table with the second round of pie and the last of Roberta's wine. And I let it ring, and I looked at Claudia, and she looked at me, and she said, "Are you going to answer?" And I said, "No," and she said, "Good." And that was the right answer, and the only answer, and the answer I should have been giving for about 14 years before that particular Thursday. What I did not do was gloat. And I want to be clear about that, because this is not a story about cruelty. It is a story about a woman who cooked Thanksgiving for the right people for the first time in her life and felt what it was like to be at a table where her presence was the point and not her usefulness. And the following morning I called my mother, and I said, "I'm sorry about Carol's oven." And my mother said, "Grace, 14 people ate crackers and cheese for Thanksgiving dinner." And I said, "I know, Mom." And she said, "Carol is very upset." And I said, "I understand." And she said she expected you to answer. And I said, "I know she did." And my mother was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "I should have said something when she called you and told you not to come." And I said, "Yes, you should have." And she said, I'm sorry. And I said, I know, Mom. And I said, next year come to mine. And she said, really? And I said, yes. And she said, just us? And I said, just us. And she said, okay. And we talked for a while longer. And it was the most honest conversation my mother and I had managed in a long time. And I think Carol's raw turkey did more for my relationship with my mother than 14 years of showing up to cook for people who saw me as the kitchen and not as the guest. And this Thanksgiving, I am cooking again, and the table is set for 5, and my mother is coming.